All right, well, it is now 4:05 in Copenhagen and it is 10:05 in the US. So I think we will begin our webinar. Very excited to have you all join us today, and that's great. We have Ifoma, of course, our guest speaker. She's checking in from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Yeah, we're really happy that you're here for this very timely and important webinar with Dr. Ifoma Anjua today. I am starting the call today. I won't take much of your time because I want to entirely focus on what Ifoma has to share with us today, but I will just briefly introduce the webinar and include a few housekeeping items that I'd like to make you aware of. My name is Louisa Murphy, and I'm a coordinator at the UN Prime, also known as the Principles for Responsible Management Education. And a few housekeeping items from our side is that, as you've already kindly done, we would ask that you turn off your video and sound during Ifoma's presentation. We'll also have our moderator, Bob McNulty, present briefly on B4P and their important work as a Prime working group after I say a few things. But we would just ask that you keep your video and sound off during these remarks. Today's webinar is recorded. We hope that's okay with you. We assume it is, and you can, of course, message us if you're uncomfortable with that. With regard to questions during the webinar today, for Ifoma, we would request that you put the questions in the chat or also raise your hand. And of course, it would be great if you could introduce yourself and your affiliation. Now, I will just tell you a little bit about UN Prime for those of you who are unfamiliar with it. I'll share a few slides with you. As you might know, the Principles for Responsible Management Education was established in 2007 by a task force of deans and academic institutions. As the name suggests, we are a UN-sponsored initiative, and we consider ourselves to be the academic arm of the UN Global Compact. We're delighted that some of our colleagues from the UN Global Compact are actually joining us for the webinar today. And we are, our purpose really is to raise the sustainability profile of business schools around the world. But of course, you might ask, how do you actually go about doing that? Well, similar to the UN Global Compact and their 10 principles for business, we work through 6 principles to provide future business leaders with the skills they need to address the sustainable development goals by aligning with the UN Global Compact. So we have our 6 principles for business schools. Give you an idea of our reach around the world. We currently have about 860 signatories, business school signatories that is, operating in 95 countries. We also have 14 regional chapters. These are our arms and legs around the world, similar also to UN Global Compact local networks, or Global Compact networks rather. And we have 8 working groups, like the Business for Peace working group today. Just to provide you with a little bit of background about our Prime working groups, which we're delighted to have, and what they do. Working groups are networks of academics who are committed to advancing responsible management education, but specifically a responsible management issue within a particular SDG area. As you can see, we have 8 working groups. Other than the Business for Peace working group, we have a working group on anti-corruption, business and human rights, climate change, gender equality, humanistic management, anti-poverty, and a sustainability mindset. So please visit our website. I'll put in a link and find out more about our working groups and what we do at Prime. Everything we do is very much in the spirit of, if you want to change business, you have to change how business is taught. Finally, I'll just conclude with a kind of shameless plug for the upcoming Prime Global Forum, which is held in conjunction with the UN Global Compact Leaders Summit this year. Our theme is accelerating the collective impact of management education in the decade of action. And we'll bring together companies, business schools, civil society organizations to debate this important topic. And you can also provide a link for you to register. So that's it from me. It's my pleasure to now turn over the call to Robert McNulty, who will introduce our fantastic guest speaker. Robert McNulty is a co-founder of the Business for Peace Working Group. So Bob, I am now going to turn the call over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, let me begin with a few thanks. First, I want to say thank you to Professor Ifeoma Ajunwa for speaking with us today on an extremely important topic, especially at this moment in time. And I want to thank you, Luisa, and our colleagues at Prime for being the great organization and host for this work. I also want to say thank you to Christina Bache, who is our chair, but who would normally be hosting today's session, but asked me to fill in for her as she was quite busy, but I think she may be in the audience at this time. And so I wanted to, and also I want to say I thank everybody from around the world that is joining this talk today. I hope that you will find our work value, and if so, I hope that you will consider joining our working group, and you can learn more about us at our website, which is unprime.b4p.org. We'll put that in the chat. Speaking of chat, I noticed my chat was disabled, Lisa, and that may be true for others. And if so, I wonder if we can have the chat opened up. A couple of things just about our organization. When we founded this working group, it was following the establishment of the Prime, the Global Compact's Business for Peace steering committee, and they were holding a number of meetings, and then we tried to bring that work to the business school arena through Prime. And actually the founder of that is with us today, Sir Mark Moody Stewart. Thank you for being here, Sir Mark. But we have, throughout our time, have been pretty much been focusing on serious conflict, focusing on the role that businesses can help in areas of the world that are facing serious conflict, and how they can be a force that's contributing to stabilization and ultimately advancing peace. Our focus has tended to be externally oriented. The idea was that those of us in wealthy nations, businesses in the more industrialized nations, can be of service to the regions and conflict zones, which typically are in less developed areas. But we really have been failing to kind of turn the focus on ourselves. And the events of the last year, since the brutal killing of George Floyd and the outrage that sparked a global Black Lives Movement, has really shined a light on our need to insist on societal change. And societal change will never happen if it doesn't also involve the business community. And so we think that the business community has traditionally been a source of the problem. When we talk about systemic racism or structural racism, well, it couldn't survive if those structures were not reinforced by business. But it's also possible for business to have a kind of awakening and address this problem. And that is certainly what we're hoping will happen. And there's been some very hopeful developments in the last year. So we were absolutely delighted when Dr. Ifeoma Ajunwa would agree to speak to us, speak to our group on this issue. And I won't go into details about her background, but Dr. Ajunwa, or Ifeoma as we'll call her, is a law professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. and an associate professor at the Ken Flager School of Business, also at UNC. She was formerly associate professor of labor relations and law in the history department at Cornell University, and has a strong background in issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, where she also serves as a consultant. Her talk will last between 15 to 25, maybe 30 minutes. After that, we'll go to a Q&A. If you want to pose a question, you can raise your hand or put a question in the chat text, and we'll go to those as we can. And we should mention that we will end the program promptly, I'd say actually at 5 minutes after the hour, if that's okay. Normally we would stop promptly, but at the hour, but we got a little bit of a slow start, so we can extend it for 5 minutes. You will be able to see the video from this webinar. It should be displayed on a link to that should be appearing on our website. So with that, I just want to say how delighted and honored I truly am to have Ifeoma Junwa with us today. So Ifeoma, it's all yours.
Thank you so much for having me, Bob. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak with business leaders and organizational leaders all over the world. And I hope we can have a great conversation about making Black Lives Matter in business. So I'll now start sharing my slides. I guess somebody will be taking the questions that come in, or maybe I might be able to see them. We'll see after the Q&A. So yes, today I'll be talking about making Black Lives Matter in business. And I'll really be focusing on Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy and dream of what equality would look like in the United States. So many people are quite familiar with the March on Washington, Martin Luther King's iconic March on Washington, where he gave the I Have a Dream speech. And this speech is remembered for its exhortation for multiracial unity and equality. And Martin Luther King really envisioned a future where all races in America can live in harmony and all people can have equal opportunity and equal protection under the law. Unfortunately, this has not turned out to be the case yet. As of now, what we are witnessing is that Black Americans frequently are targeted by police and are disproportionately killed at the hands of police. We also have other racial disparities. For example, we have the white-Black wealth gap. So in 2016, the typical white family had about 10 times the wealth of the typical Black family. And just to give you an idea, this has actually increased from the time that Martin Luther King Jr. was fighting for civil rights. Also, you have high rates of Black unemployment. The Black unemployment rate is consistently twice the rate of the white unemployment rate. You also have historical employment discrimination. So in terms of complaints received by the EEOC, the highest portion of those are complaints on the basis of race or color, skin color discrimination. Finally, I want to reorient us because while the March on Washington is always remembered for its platitudes about racial harmony, we kind of lose sight of what Martin Luther King believed was the way that we would get there. So the full name of the March on Washington was actually March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So inherent in that assertion is really the assumption that economic opportunity and economic equality were actually necessary to sustain freedom, to sustain democracy, to sustain peace. So while we have focused thus far in American society on dealing with issues of police brutality, on dealing with issues of criminal social justice, we have somewhat, I believe, lost the focus of looking at full economic inclusion as a necessary part of freedom, as a necessary part of the quest for peace. And it's high time we went back to Dr. Martin Luther King's vision. So March 25th, as many of you know, marked the anniversary of the death of George Floyd. George Floyd was a Black man who was brutally murdered at the hands of police, and the murder of which was captured on video, the striking video, which then galvanized the Black Lives Matter movement. And George Floyd has become the face of the movement. And the question is, a year after he became the face of a movement, has much changed? What is the role of corporations in enacting change? And what sort of change do we still need? So Floyd's death re-sparked the Black Lives Matter movement, but it's also important to remember that the Black Lives Matter movement that George Floyd sparked was more than just about police brutality. So the protests, yes, were against the brutal killing of George Floyd, but they were also about bigger issues. They were about structural racism that exists in the United States. They were also about economic inequality that exists in the United States. So the Black Lives Matter movement was actually a big part of demanding for economic justice. And that's rethinking the way that we view the plight of African Americans. So rather than just bemoaning that, Black Americans have higher unemployment rates, or bemoaning that Black Americans have a lower wealth in comparison to their white counterparts, we need to think about ways to change that. And for the Black Lives Matter movements, that included some options such as reparations, right? Reparations are an idea that some might find controversial, but if you think about it, they are actually not a new idea. The German government, for example, did pay reparations to the victims of the Holocaust and their descendants. So it is not so far-fetched that the American government may consider or should consider paying reparations to the descendants of enslaved Africans who were a big part of building up the economy of the United States that we now have. Economic justice also includes other things like investing in Black communities and divesting from industries that are predatory towards Black communities. So many corporations did take up the mantle of the call that the Black Lives Matter movement put out, which is this demand for economic justice. So corporations like Apple, Google, McDonald's, Amazon, H&M, many tech companies especially pledged money towards racial equity. And that is both in terms of donating to corporations like the Black Lives Matter movement, but also in donating to more traditional organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and also other large civil rights organizations. Now, the question, however, is even with those donations, do we see a difference? Do corporate commitments, right, to racial equity, do they make a difference? Can we trust that corporate commitments to racial equity is really going to move the needle in terms of racial progress? Will these corporations live up to the pledges that they have made? And the evidence is mixed. So yes, corporations have donated a lot of money. They have kept up their pledges in terms of donating money to businesses, to organizations. Yet within those organizations, you get these complaints of the way that Black workers are treated within those organizations. So recently you had allegations from one worker at Google who was actually studying the ethics of AI that Google was planning to, produce and market. And she was a Black woman who was fired because she had noted the bias that was present in some of those products. So she's now embroiled in an employment dispute with Google, and she's not the only one. Also at Amazon, Black employees have expressed, discontent at the way that they are treated. They have discussed a culture of bias, disrespect, and demotions. So, the adage, right, is that charity starts at home, right? So if corporations are pledging money towards racial equity and pledging money to address racial injustice, well, then they need to start actually within their own corporate environments to address the structural racism that exists there. So what does that mean in action? So a lot of people have decried the fact that a lot of corporations will put out statements in support of Black Lives Matter, but will not necessarily do anything to change their own environments. So what is the action necessary to address employment discrimination as it exists within corporations? So first is really thinking about DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, really thinking of it as a journey, right? So DEI gets a bad rap, especially because people equate it with just, anti-racism training, somebody coming and giving a speech for one day or, for 2 hours and, teaching people to speak differently. And then the corporation saying, oh, that's great, we're done with our work in making our corporation a better place. But that's not really how DEI is supposed to work. And I say this as a certified DEI consultant. DEI is supposed to be a journey. It is a journey that starts with a careful evaluation of the corporate environment. And this can include surveys of workers. It can include interviews of workers. And of course, you will need a third party to do this to prevent any issues of retaliation, to prevent any issues of bias that could creep into the process. Then, once you've done this careful evaluation and assessment, you identify the specific problems that exist in your corporation or in your industry. And a lot of times corporations blame a non-diverse environment to issues of pipeline, for example. There are not enough software developers. But many studies actually find that's not the case. The real problem is actually how corporations are hiring diverse candidates and also how they are treating them once they are hired. So DEI doesn't really just stop at recruitment and hiring. DEI extends also to the work environment, the evaluation of the diverse talents that you have, and then also the way that their promotions are treated, how they are valued, how they are lauded for their achievements. So it really is a journey. So once you figure out the problems and you implement changes, now these has to be structural changes, not one-time changes, but changes that are meant to endure. You then also need to measure the impact of the changes that you have instituted, and you need to periodically reassess and check that the changes that you have made are working well, or whether you do need to recalibrate. So I'll repeat again, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is a journey. It is not a one-time fix. It is not a 1-hour meeting. It is a journey that requires care and financial investment. What is another plan? Well, in my forthcoming paper, I write about automation and its effects for Black Americans and, frankly, racial minorities all over the world. We have found that the jobs that are most in danger of being automated are care and retail jobs. Guess who has those jobs? Those jobs are most likely to be held by racial minorities, especially Black minorities and Black women especially. So what is the plan for how to deal with that? Even Martin Luther King Jr. in 1961 already recognized that automation was going to be an issue. Now, in the 21st century, corporations who already know this should have a plan in place for how they will deal with the effects of automation to ensure that it is not just going to widen the chasm of inequality in the world. Another action is thinking about a universal basic income. So the UBI has become prominent in the news lately because of Andrew Yang, who is running for the mayor of New York City and who was formerly a presidential candidate. And the thing is, UBI is actually not such a new topic. As far back as 1967, Martin Luther King, in his last book, did note that this could be a solution to poverty. This could be a solution to the racial inequality that we see in our United States if we think of a universal basic income as a necessary component of maintaining our economy. Because of course, if we have more poverty, that's also going to impinge on our economy and will affect us all. Finally, I want to point you to some further reading that might be of help as you think of making Black Lives Matter in business. Making Black Lives Matter in business is not merely about putting out corporate statements in support of the Black Lives Matter movements. It is not merely about doing anti-racism training that can last 1 hour or 1 day. It is about a deliberate, careful, and sustained process of evaluating your corporate environment, of evaluating what you are doing to enable your Black, to enable your Black talent to thrive in the workplace. It can also mean investing in Black businesses. It can also mean investing in Black communities where you are choosing to base your business. So perhaps instead of thinking of just the tax benefits of where you put your businesses, you also think about where can I put my businesses in terms of tapping into an underemployed population, giving people equal opportunity. So with that, I will say thank you for coming to my talk. I hope these further reading will be of help to you as you consider making your corporation an ally for Black liberation, for Black freedom, for Black equality. Thank you all. So I look forward to the Q&A.
Great.
Thank you. In terms of questions, let me see, Lisa, do you see questions in the chat?
I don't see any questions. I do see a comment from Sarah Chu about this being a really important topic around automation and the future of jobs. Sarah, I don't know, I'd like to invite you if you would like to say something more about that, perhaps, or to pose a question. Potentially to...
This is Sarah Chu.
Great,
such a great talk.
Yeah.
I'm really appreciating the input. Can people hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So this is a huge topic. I work in the cybersecurity field, and this is such an important discussion now that we're having, not only from making sure to, when we're programming new items in automated flows and things like that, it's really important to catch our biases that are being programmed into those machine learning and AI functions. So that's part of it. But I think the other really important topic is when people, who is being displaced by these new automated flows,
Right.
and how can we address that? Dr. Ajuma, could you talk a little bit more about any processes in place to help identify who these folks are, and like job training, skills, or anything like that?
Right. So that's such a great question. And I think you really hit the nail on the head, which is, you know, on the part of the federal government is really needed a large scale study of how automation is going to change the face of labor in the next few years, right? Really documenting specifically which industries will have displaced workers, and really coming up with a solid plan, either for reskilling, upskilling, or frankly, just thinking about a UBI with the recognition that as our society advances, as we have more technological advancements, not everybody might be able to have a job as it becomes, you know, more profitable to have machines doing the work. So the idea of a UBI, I think, is really one that the federal government needs to start considering seriously. And, you know, a lot of people see it as perhaps free money, or they see it as a return to like welfare dependency for certain populations. And I really want to caution against that view, because we're not saying that people shouldn't work or people should be paid merely for existing. What we're really saying is that we need a safety net, right? As a society, we need a safety net for people where we don't have people living on the streets. We don't have the crime that comes with increased, you know, homelessness. And we don't have the racial unrest that comes with unequal unemployment rates, right? When we know that the industries that are going to be especially impacted by automation are industries with large minority populations. I see a hand up from John Tin.
Hey, Professor Ajuma. It's good to see you.
Hello, how are you? Great to see you.
Yeah, likewise. I wanted to ask, I know you had done some research or had a recommendation around almost an auditing standard for algorithms. I just wanted to hear, maybe, has that view changed? As you were talking to more people, are people receptive to that in terms of giving a certification, right? I believe was the proposal that you had.
Yeah, so that's an important comment, and that actually refers to the first reading on my reading slide, which is the auditing imperative for automated hiring systems. So what I have found in my research is that a lot of the ways that inequality is maintained is of course through employment discrimination. But employment discrimination in this day and age looks very different from what we would have seen in like the 1960s, where you had one ad saying, you know, no Blacks, Irish, or others apply. Now we have automated hiring systems where even if you are able to find a job and apply, you have automated systems that can actually weed people out using proxy variables, right, that relate to race or even to gender and other protected categories. So this actually makes it harder to detect and also harder to prevent employment discrimination. So one of my suggestions is that there could be an auditing system in place governed by the United States government. So it could be through an agency like the EEOC, for example, which would actually audit the automated hiring systems that companies use. And as part of this audit, they could get a certifying mark before they could use such systems to ensure that the systems are not biased, right? To ensure that the systems are not going to essentially perpetuate employment discrimination. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome.
Great. I think we also have a question from Mark Meany. Mark, I'm not sure if you'd like to ask to ask it yourself.
Sure. I wonder, Doctor, have you had a chance to take a look at what happened at base camp? the software company. Just to give you a little bit of background,
Yeah.
this would really, I think, warrant an in-depth look by all of us. What happened was that about 2009, 2010, senior management developed a list as a joke, making fun of people's names. Okay. And while there were some European names on the list, most names were Asian, African-American, et cetera, et cetera. Fast forward to this year, employees discovered the list and began to question how the list emerged and how could Basecamp support a culture that would engage in this kind of quote unquote joking. And there then became, it's a project management software company. So employees began to use the project management software as a means to bring into question the thought processes of the two co-founders, right? That they would have allowed this and they would have participated in creating this list, which was obviously discriminatory, right? And so there was a very lively discussion taking place among employees about racism generally, right? But really about what was going on in that company, right? A kind of systemic racism that was rooted in the culture of the organization. Well, the CEO shut down the conversation. And in a blog post, he said, we're not going to continue to discuss issues regarding society and politics, right? And again, the employees went around what he was saying. And literally, within a matter of a couple of weeks, some 80 employees, including, 5 really high level senior managers left the company. So I really feel like, this is a really important example of how it is, what happens when we try to raise these questions in a corporate environment. And if you don't do it in a way that is effective, companies are going to, 80 employees left that company. That's an amazing amount of so I just mentioned that. I think people should take a close look at what happened at Basecamp and try to, based on what happened at Basecamp, think in terms of how it is that we can have these kinds of conversations in a constructive manner within a corporate environment.
Yeah. So thank you so much for that question. I really think that question highlights how corporations can miss opportunities to learn and grow, right? Once the employees were having this discussion, this could actually have been an opportunity for the CEO of the company to realize we have a problem. We have a race sensitivity problem, or a bigger problem really of civility, right, and how we treat our workers. So this could have been an opportunity for the employees to get a chance, right, to be heard in terms of being able to share the structural issues that are present in the company, whether it's racism or classism or, just plain insensitivity from CEOs or managers. And once again, this is also where DEI training comes in, right? So this is a chance for the company to bring in experts to meet with employees and say, tell us your grievances, tell us your concerns, tell us how we can do better. So these sort of incidents actually end up being quite costly for corporations, because it's not just the cost of losing employees and the high turnover, it's also the cost of goodwill. These incidents do tarnish the image of your corporation, and it does make talent, right? These days, talent is mobile, right? We no longer have the idea that somebody's going to work at a company for like 50 years and then retire. Talent is mobile. So if you have an organization where the environment is hostile because of racism or anything else, talent will leave, and you will have a more difficult time attracting talent to your company. So I really appreciate that you surfaced this story, because I feel like this was such a missed opportunity by this company to really assess its environment, its corporate environment, and really make necessary changes that could actually have made it a better workplace. So, this is truly sad that, they didn't have the mindset of growth, right? The growth mindset of recognizing our employees are saying there's a problem. Let's, systematically deal with this problem instead of shutting down any sort of like discontent. And I see another question in the box, text box, that's asking, what would you suggest to multinational businesses that wish to apply some of the lessons from the Black Lives Matter movement to their own operations? We at the UN Global Compact Network UK have been running a largely UK-based, UK-focused BLM and business webinar series. So listening to your US-focused perspective has been very insightful. So first, I want to thank you for asking that question, because the fact of the matter is most businesses now are multinational. The large businesses are not just based in one jurisdiction of like US or UK. Rather, large businesses are operating across borders. They're operating multinationally, and therefore they are encountering a diverse array of problems. So the sort of racial problems you have in the UK may be quite different from the racial problems you have in the US. So for example, one thing I can tell you from the US context that I feel like may not be as pronounced in the UK context is the idea of residential segregation, right? So for example, if you're a multinational company and you do something like, oh, we're planning to hire and we're gonna use zip codes as part of our hiring, right? Zip code is basically indicating like the region you live in. And there's many reasons why corporations do this. The first one is just the idea of, if we use a zip code of people who live near our office, we know they're gonna come to work on time. We know there's going to be perhaps greater productivity because they might stay longer on the workplace. But in the United States, the use of zip code can have racial implications, which is something that maybe multinational corporations may not understand, because racial segregation by residents in the United States is so much more pronounced than, say, in the UK. So just really being attentive and sensitive to the ways that racial inequality might differ in different countries is important. Another thing that has now started making more inroads into the consciousness, right, of DEI experts everywhere is the idea of caste discrimination, for example, right? So caste discrimination is something that you have in India, but it's actually something that's also being transplanted to other areas like the US, where you have large Indian populations working in, for example, tech. So we're now actually seeing more and more cases of Indians alleging caste discrimination against other Indians. And that's something that's not actually fully captured by American case law, because of course we don't necessarily have caste discrimination on the same level as you do in India. Although some sociologists would argue that perhaps the race-based discrimination we have in the US, focused particularly on Black people, is a form of caste discrimination, but this is a matter of semantics. But the main idea really is just being sensitive to whatever country you're operating in, whatever jurisdiction you're operating in, to really think about what are the roots of racial inequality in those areas. How can I ensure that my company is not making it worse, right? How can I ensure that my company is taking steps to ameliorate that racial inequality? I see another hand up from Mark Moody. I can't see your full last name, so I apologize for that.
Well, that's quite all right. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I just wanted to, since you were speaking about international, multinational corporations, I could give you an example. If you go back to the 90s, when I was part of the executive leadership of Shell. We looked at our executive committee, and it was after 30 years of, to my personal knowledge, hiring people from different nationalities, extremely able men and women of different nationalities all around the world, getting many of them coming to senior jobs. Many of them worked outside their own countries and had opportunities to test themselves in an international environment. Nonetheless, if we looked at the composition of the executive committee, it was uniform, male, white, and either British or Dutch, and occasional American. And this was, frankly, statistically, to me, it was statistically implausible. We couldn't blame the supply chain, as it were, because we knew we'd hired people, able people from all around the world. So there had to be other invisible barriers. So we set up a group, and it's a long story, looking at what those barriers might be, and with some help from a very able African-American woman called Leslie Mays, we did quite a lot of work, and we had a group of people from all around the world, different ages, talking about, what were the difficulties. Now, these are not as I say, we'd put a huge amount of effort into trying to make sure that people had the experience, that they had the job opportunities, but somehow the final result was, as I say, statistically implausible. Yeah. And what we found, of course, that there are many, unless you have deep and ongoing discussions on what might be the barriers. For example, we set in Shell for senior management a great store on mobility, people who had experience living and working in different parts of the world. And I've lived in 10 different countries. But that in itself, if you put a big emphasis on that, is a barrier to some people because of language, education, employment of spouses, you name it, you can go on. So if you look at each list, each aspect, you find that there are these barriers. So something which looks like a desirable advantage may turn out to be a barrier. And actually, we did some work, and Shell is a highly analytical company. It's a technological company. And we had a discussion, which I was interesting, and I pushed back at times to say, are there other things which give a particular advantage in Shell to people? And there clearly were. I mean, if you say, okay, men and women, well, you don't have to be a genius to say men probably have an advantage. You look at technical people versus non-technical. Yeah, technical people working in the bits of the company which made most money, the production side. Yeah, engineers versus others. Graduates of Oxford, Cambridge, and Delft in Holland. Yeah. Now, these are things, many of those things, a good education is an advantage, but it's so mobility, as I put. So we listed, 15 different things. And then we checked who's in, if of these, for example, a spouse who was prepared to travel around the world and supportive, as it were. And we listed 15 of them. And I am in every single advantage group, every single one.
So I think what you're highlighting is really a problem that I have seen in other industries as well, in other corporations, which is that corporations can really develop, right, this profile of who they think makes a good worker. And they can believe that profile is objective, right? Because everything you've just outlined, none of it is actually specific to race, for example, right? Good education, but the thing is how you define what is a good education, right? Is what starts to make it more race-based. So corporations get these profiles in mind that they develop over time based on obviously historic bias, right, of who first gets hired and then who becomes successful. So then they develop this picture in their mind of this is what our successful worker looks like. And they think this is objective. But once you break down the components, right, then you start to find perhaps it's not quite as objective. And like you said, perhaps it's really painting a picture of a white male. So, like you mentioned, like somebody who went to Oxbridge, right? Well, look at the percentages of who's at Oxbridge. If that's your pool of applicants, then you're already narrowing the pool, right? You're already cherry picking, for lack of a better word. So I really do think that corporations need to take a hard look at what is our profile that we have created of who is a good worker, and how does that profile really perpetuate racial inequality? And do we need to rethink our profile? Are there ways that we can rethink our profile and still maintain productivity and still get excellent workers? So for example, you talked about good education. Well, in many countries, there are universities that rival the Oxbridge, system, right? So maybe the companies can make a concerted effort to actually go and recruit from those universities in other countries. And in such a way, they can get actually a wider array of candidates. I see Bob is signaling me. Oh, sorry.
We were not recruiting people specifically from Oxford and Cambridge. It was just the perception of people,
right, exactly,
that was a very good education. So someone who had that, or who spoke fluent English, for example.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so a big part of it is obviously changing that perception, right? Getting a wider perception of who can be successful in the corporation. So Bob, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I hesitate to ask a question because I want to leave it open for our guests, but I have a kind of basic question that I think might be of interest to everyone here, which is that it's been a year since the tragedy of the killing of George Floyd and the incredible movement that emerged, and the response by business has been quite striking. And this is something you've been looking at very carefully. My question is that when you look back over this year, can you sort of summarize or give some kind of examples of where you feel things are most hopeful and where you feel they're falling down and that we're still colorblind in terms of seeing our own inabilities to really address the issue that we're concerned with?
Well, thank you very much for that question, because I do think there is hope, right? I do see glimmers of progress. I think especially when it comes to education. So we know that a lot of money has now been donated to historically Black colleges and universities, right? And we know also that actually historically Black colleges and universities do a great job of educating, Black people who end up in high-level positions. So our Vice President, Kamala Harris, is a product of the HBCU system. So for me, it is very heartening to see so many businesses recognizing the value of historically Black colleges and universities and donating money to ensure that those institutions can thrive and those institutions can continue to be a source of educating really talented Black folks. So that for me is a huge glimmer of hope. I also see more of, I guess I also see more of a willingness to even have the conversation of race in the workplace. I think for far too long, as you mentioned, there has been a colorblind approach to hiring, a colorblind approach to promotion. And I really want to highlight that last part, because I think up until now, a lot of the focus on diversity in the workplace has really just focused on entry level, right? It's just focused on hiring. And I think with this year, we're actually having a deeper conversation where, as Mark pointed out, we're looking at the elite echelons, right? We're looking at the management class. We're saying, oh, not just how many Black employees do you have, but we're saying how many of your Black employees are in leadership positions, right? How many of your important decision making actually involve Black people, where they can actually give you, great guidance. For example, if you're trying to reach Black consumers, we've seen it obviously in the past. A lot of corporations have made missteps because of a lack of Black leadership when they're trying to reach out to consumers, and they've really fallen on their face a lot of times. And I think this year we're really starting to have that conversation of the value of not just, diversity for diversity's sake, where you say, oh, we have 3 or 4 Black employees, but really the value of inclusion, full inclusion in the workplace, where you not just have Black workers, but you also have Black leaders. And essentially Black leaders are fully included in the workplace. So that is making me very, very hopeful.
Great. Our time is essentially over. Technically, it is over. But I think if I understand, some people have already mentioned they need to get on to their next meeting. But we'll perhaps have one last question, if it's one that can be answered quickly, and then we'll wrap this up. If there's any one last question that somebody wants to raise.
Can I ask about reparations?
Oh, yes. So, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, because I do think actually that businesses have a role to play in reparations. I think thus far, we've really thought of reparations as merely a governmental issue, like will the government, approve it? How much should it be? That sort of thing. But we haven't really considered what role businesses could play in reparations. So some of the research I have done has actually looked at how certain businesses did benefit from the slave trade, right? Certain businesses did benefit from the Jim Crow era. So those corporations, even without an official declaration of the, reparations from the US government, those corporations could take it upon themselves to start a reparations effort. And you can ask yourself, what can this look like? How could they really do this at scale? Well, I'll give you an example of some organizations, not necessarily corporations, that are already doing reparation-like efforts. So Georgetown University, for example, recently found that the university itself was actually established with money earned from selling slaves. So these were, Catholic priests that owned slaves, and they sold them, and that was the money that was in large part used to establish Georgetown University. As a result, Georgetown University decided that it would have reparations for the descendants of those enslaved people. So that means those descendants can attend Georgetown free of tuition, right? So they can attend Georgetown for free. So that is one just little example of reparations. But how could corporations do this? Corporations can do this by, for example, targeting hiring of descendants of enslaved people who perhaps the corporations benefited from in the past. It could establish programs that are educational programs, or training programs, which would also be pipeline programs, right, for hiring those people into the corporations. So I really do think that there's a lot that corporations can do if they put their mind to it, and that it doesn't necessarily have to all hinge on the government to have an official declaration for reparations.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for
Thank
that
you.
question.
Ifoma, I'm sorry, but our time has come to an end, and it's a fascinating talk and a very, very important subject. I'm particularly pleased to see that I believe, in this way have expanded some of the thinking that we have around the whole idea of business for peace. I think it's absolutely important, and we absolutely need to keep this in mind. And it was a wonderful talk, and thank you for sharing your time and experience and wisdom and heartfelt insights with all of us. And with that, I'll say goodbye and thank you to everybody. And if you want to see the recording, you can go to our website later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for attending. You can also find me on my website or by email. Please feel free to reach out. Thank you and goodbye.